Okay, welcome back to the second part of this slideshow, Conceptualizing and Measuring Cognitive Affective Social State, CAS state, where we're going to be looking at the results of our research study conducted between 2012-2014 with 8 different schools, 2,000 students, 5,000 lesson simulations where we were assessing CAS state. And we were testing the hypothesis, does the ability to adjust CAS state to an optimal state for the learning task in hand explain or correlate with successful or unsuccessful learners as measured by other measures of successful learning in schools. So the first thing I want to show you is this chart here, quite a striking chart, and the chart is looking at instinctive CAS state data. So here we are looking at the non-situational CAS state scores of individuals, so when they are not engaged in a particular learning task, their baseline state, and we're looking at the mean CAS state scores in age-specific bands. So we've got age-specific bands, year 3 right the way up school years to year 13, and then an adult band as well. So we're taking mean scores against these 4 different CAS factors as modelled by Walker's 7-factor model of CAS. So we're not looking at 3 other factors here which weren't measured as part of this study, but these 4 factors here. And what we've got the sample sizes here from which the means were taken. And what we see is a remarkable pattern which has emerged. So for example, if we take disclosure here and we look down at year 3, we see that year 3 children have as a mean CAS instinctive score a low disclosure scores. And that score then rises as children get older up to year 8, year 10, year 13, and to adults where it becomes roughly the mean point of the scale, 7.5 between 0 and 15. And that is a very clear linear chronological progression. If we look at the next factor of embracing change, we see that with young children it starts off high and then works its way down towards, again, a mean of about 7.5, just under that, around 7, with adults. Look at the next factor of trust of oneself, one's own ideas and opinions. That starts high, and again that goes down towards that very similar mean, just around about 7. Trust of others starts low with young children and goes up chronologically in this lovely linear sequence here to roughly the mean, again about 7.2. So we get this pattern which surprised us, if we're honest. We were not expecting to see such a chronological progression over years in instinctive CAS state scores. And if you take any one single year of that, so for example we've taken a slice of that data here, we've taken the year 10 slice, and then we're drilling down and we're looking at 4 different cohorts of year 10s from 4 different schools from around the UK, different countries, all tested independently. Again, what we find is that even in those different locations, different geographies, different backgrounds, different settings, the instinctive CAS state scores of year 10 students from across the country shows this remarkable similarity of pattern. This time we're looking across all 7 of the factors. Now, in fact, if we look at all 7 of those factors across these year groups which we did measure, then just as we were looking at the 4 factors in the earlier chart that developed over time in that trajectory, so when we look at the other 3 as well, we see them also developing towards this mean over an age-specific context. Now, the next thing that we did was to look at the instinctive CAS state scores of year 10 students across 4 different schools. This is the chart we were looking at just a moment ago, about just under 500 students in this sample size. And we were interested in comparing whether the instinctive CAS state scores of these children changed or varied from their school ecological CAS state scores. In other words, if we took a mean of their situational CAS scores when they were engaging in school context across all of their different lessons, would it show any variance from their instinctive state? In other words, was their CAS changed by their participation engagement in school? So let me just overlay the ecological school scores and see what happens. And I hope you saw there that whilst we're looking at the same set of schools, the chart has changed, the topography of the chart has changed. So we are looking at, and what we observed is that ecological CAS state scores are not necessarily the same as instinctive CAS state scores, that the environment is doing something to students' CAS. Let's break that down a little bit, and if we look at one school here, the instinctive scores for those students in year 10 is shown in the blue chart behind here, and I've overlaid here the school scores, and you can see the variance here, and there's a significant ecological impact, if you like, where bracing change and trust of self is lower, trust of others is enormously higher, from this very low point about 3.8 here up to about 8.1 here. So the environment is having a huge impact on the CAS state of these students when they are engaging in school. We can look at that same data. Some people find it more helpful to look at it this way. Again, we've got the two profiles of the dark instinctive scores and then the ecological situational impact of school B, and this is showing us, if you like, the ecological dividend of the school, how it is affecting the overall CAS state of that population of year 10 students when they're on the school premises. When we discovered that some schools impose a collective CAS state on all students, so again here's a chart of another school, year 10 students, the dark is the instinctive CAS state score overlaid with the light here, and you can see this very flat ecological environmental CAS state which has been imposed and flattened the peaks and pulled up the troughs across this population of year 10s, across all 7 of these factors. There we go, there's the contrast there. It's a very flat topography, cognitive affective social topography in that school compared to the instinctive state scores of those children. So whilst some schools imposed a collective state on their students, what we found with other schools, and here's one here, is that the CAS state of the environment really mirrored and followed the CAS state score of the students. It really was having no impact on it at all, and it appears that the students are almost imposing their CAS state score on the school, determining that school environment rather than the other way round. The next thing that we looked at was to see whether there was any variance in CAS state across different sets, different ability sets. Here I've got the results, again there's 7 different factors here of one particular school, set 7, so the bottom set cohort here, and we've got 3 different sets of results. We've got the instinctive score for set 7 in grey at the back there, we've got their English set of scores in blue, and we've got their math set of scores in green. We can see that there's very little alteration across those 3 different environments in the mean scores, CAS state scores for set 7. Now if I just click and we look at set 5, so a slightly higher set here, fairly similar to set 7, again not much change. We've got an additional subject in here of science, we've got now got English, science and maths, still got an instinctive at the back, not a lot of change across here apart from this one factor here, trust of others, where in maths that has gone up distinctly. Let's roll on, let's have a look, and we looked at set 2, so one of the better more high-performing academic sets, and suddenly we're seeing something quite different going on here, and we're seeing pattern. At the back there we've got a peak of trust of self in the instinctive scores, so the set 2 children have a mean higher trust of self score at the back there, about 8.5, but in their lessons across, specifically in maths, less so in science and English, that hasn't really change very much, but in maths that trust of self drops quite significantly. But the trust of others goes shooting right up. Very interesting. And then when we looked at set 1, we found this very interesting pattern. We found that, again, similar to set 2, the students started off with a high trust of themselves, and then that drops right down. We'll see that in the next slide. But across all 3 lessons here, their trust of others peaks and is much, much, much higher than their instinctive trust of self. So let's look at that same data. This again is set 1 here, and I've just turned this chart round because I want you to see the back of it. There's that grey instinctive score. You can see how low their instinctive trust of others is and how high their instinctive trust of themselves is, and how that then flips round in their context of their lessons when they're engaging in science and English and maths there, to a high trust of others and lower trust of themselves. We see that pattern here, and that is really in very strong contrast to what we saw in set 7 here, where it was very flat, and we saw what's actually across the mean here, a slightly higher than average trust of self, which remains higher than average, and higher than average trust of others, which remains the case. And this trust of others, trust of self, seems to be a distinct pattern between set 1 and set 7. And you might say to yourself, okay, well, what we're observing there is some intrinsic ability of set 1 students to adjust their CAS state, to have a low trust of themselves, high trust of others, and set 7 students just haven't got that ability. And we'll come on to look at whether the extent to which that is true. But we have noticed some very interesting features which slightly complicate the picture. We found that CAS state is not simply determined by an intrinsic student ability, but that environmental factors such as the school's expectations and indeed the student's self-perceptions can what we call activate and deactivate student CAS state. This is a very interesting chart. This is in a different school, and what we found is in this other school, this familiar pattern here in the top grades, predicted grade sets. We found low trust of self, high trust of others in their lessons, and we found that across all schools, in fact, that the high set students have predominantly a low trust of themselves and a high trust of others when they're engaging in their lessons. We found that less so with the B grades. In fact, let me take you up to the EFG grades, because you see again, even though this was in a different school, similar to the previous set of results, we find this high trust of self, high trust of others in the lowest set children. But strangely and unexpectedly, what we didn't expect to find was a pattern in the D grade students that mirrored the pattern in the A grade students. That same pattern re-emerged of a high trust of others, low trust of themselves when they were engaging in their lessons. It wasn't seen in the EFG students, and then bizarrely it wasn't seen in the C grade students either. It was seen in the A grade students, to a lesser extent in B grade, disappeared in C grade, and then reappeared in the D grade and disappears in EF grade. And in fact, EFG grade and C grade, this is the least optimal learning state, CAS state, if you like, that we think gives the student quite a complacent attitude where they have a high trust of their own ideas and opinions, and they're not really bothered about internalizing other people's. They're not energized or prepared to strain or work hard to engage. There's a degree of complacency here, which seems to be present in both the EFG grades, perhaps because they think that there's no point trying, and also in the C grade students, perhaps because they think they've tried hard enough, because the C grade is the key border, the borderline in GCSE scores. And we know that schools will put a great deal of effort into this D grade population here to try to persuade them that they can get up to a C grade. And that school expectation and the student perception is clearly having an activating or deactivating effect on our students. So the CAS state of individuals is not simply determined by intrinsic student ability, but seems to be able to be activated, deactivated, affected by the environmental expectations. This, and indeed other results which I write up in my paper on the ecological factors of CAS, support the proposal that CAS state is a neuroecological state which may be influenced by the interaction between the individuals and the environment. However, we did also look for evidence that CAS state may be influenced by intrinsic mental ability. And this was our hypothesis that we were setting out to test, that successful learners might be expected to show a higher ability to adjust their CAS state to fit the learning task in hand, i.e. to adjust their CAS state as they move from lesson to lesson to an optimal state. They're better able to do that than less successful learners. So we looked at high and low performing students, and here's a chart of a high performing student with a high CAT score, cognitive ability test score, who was predicted to get 3A grades, and he was a pupil in year 10 in school H. And what you can see here is his intrinsic scores at the back there, and then his maths, English, science scores running along here. We can see his typical lower trust of self and slightly higher trust in others. See how he adjusts that from high trust of self to in his instinctive state and low trust of others, and he modulates that to that more optimal state. We can see how there are subtle but clear modulations across all the subjects, becoming more highly disclosing, becoming more planning orientated, and a number of other changes here as well. Now, if I move on now to lower attaining students, what we see immediately is that the CAS state score across their subjects is less flexible. We've got two here which are very similar to each other, and this one here is very similar to the instinctive score at the back. So this student who has a lower CAT score, cognitive ability test score, is predicted to get much lower grades, DCD, shows a very different pattern of modulation, much less modulation, and rather inconsistent, unpredictable modulation. Again, this pattern of high trust of self and indeed low trust of others here. So if we compare the two, we can see that we've got two very different patterns in terms of the variation that there is seen across here compared to this student. And in fact, what we did was to rank the modulation. If I just go back to that previous chart, we identified the pattern of CAS scores that correlated with the highest performing students. We ranked those scores and gave each student a CAS rank score that indicated the optimality of their adjustment of their CAS state from lesson to lesson, so that each student had not just a CAT score, cognitive ability test score, but a CAS score. And what we found was that there was a significant contribution of CAS modulation score, that CAS rank score, the ability to optimally adjust one's CAS state with predicted GCSE grade in year 10 students. We found that there was a correlation of around 0.39 with grade prediction, which accounts for roughly 20% of the variance in within school GCSE grade prediction within that particular study. So there's a significant that hypothesis that the ability to modulate your CAS state to the proposed optimal state for the task in hand is evidenced here, that there is a 0.39 correlation with grade prediction, that better learners do modulate their CAS state better than less successful learners. We also found that the proportion of GCSE grade variance in the cohort that couldn't be assigned to CAT, in other words to the CAT cognitive ability test results, was able to be assigned to CAS, and we identified this through factor analysis, and we found that a proportion of variance loaded onto CAS but did not load onto CAT. So CAS state seems to be measuring something which is not measured by CAT score. It's a different quotient, it's a different function that we are measuring here, which isn't currently being measured by the cognitive ability test. And we also then found in another study that the change in CAS modulation. In other words, we measured students' CAS scores at the start of the term and then at the end of the term, and in between we provided some of those students, a proportion of those students, with coaching to improve their CAS scores where they were weak. And we found that at the end of those 10 weeks, when they redid their CAS tests, that not only had their grades improved, but a significant proportion, about a 0.2 effect size of grade change, could be attributed to the shift in CAS rank. Some of those students had improved in CAS rank and their scores, their grade predictions had gone up, and others had sadly not improved in their CAS rank scores, and some of their grades had gone down. So these results indicate that whilst CAS modulation contributes to CAT, it doesn't appear that CAT, Cognitive Ability Test, which is a measure of general intelligence, G, CAT score does not appear to contribute significantly to the distinctive factor of CAS modulation. Okay, so our proposal was that the ability to adjust CAS state is implicated in the ability to learn, and that's what we have found evidence to support, that the ability to adjust that CAS state for different environments to an optimal state correlates with academic ability, and it measures something which is not measured by a measure of general intelligence, in this case the CAT test. Okay. So where does this leave us? Some outstanding questions. Well, one question that we have is the ability to adjust CAS state a conscious or unconscious metacognitive agency? We know it's obviously a way of describing, talking about metacognition, the brain's ability to think about its thinking, but is that a conscious thinking or an unconscious thinking? Secondly, how does the ability to alter CAS state appropriately for the task in hand relate to wider non-academic executive function? So if we were to compare it with other measures of executive function, what would we find there? Thirdly, can CAS state ability be improved by coaching? Well, we've had some evidence of an initial small pilot study to that effect, which I will talk about in another forthcoming PowerPoint. Can it be improved by coaching? And fourthly, what does the CAS state dividend, in other words, the neurological impact of different schools, contribute to education? What is that impact of school on the CAS state of students? What is that impact providing by way of dividend to the educational outcomes? Okay, thank you very much. Please join us for the next slideshow, where we're going to be looking at the outcome of a study that has sought to coach CAS state and the ability to modulate it accurately.